In 1996, Resident Evil revolutionized the survival horror genre and did it once again in 2004 when Resident Evil 4 reinvented itself into a third-person, over-the-shoulder blend of action and survival horror. There has never not been a vast library of Resident Evil clones through the years, and most are never able to truly stand on their own. Usually, if one company has a successful franchise, another company needs a portion of this fortune, and that's just what EA did. Dead Space would take on Resident Evil, namely Resident Evil 4, and would successfully and quickly grow it into its own franchise spanning prequels, sequels, and parallel stories across main entries, spin-offs, books, comics, and movies. EA was all in on Dead Space. In 2008, Dead Space would emerge from the dark depths of space. Developed by EA Redwood Shores, the developers were previously known for games such as the My Sims franchise, various Tiger Woods PGA Tour games, and multiple 007 James Bond games. But Dead Space was a truly original game that made the studio known and stand out. See, Dead Space dared to go to the one location Resident Evil could never, and Resident Evil has been set in some pretty unusual locations. Dead Space was set in, well, as the title says, space. After all, it's like they say, in space, no one can hear you scream. Its realistic, futuristic setting allowed the game to write its own path and do things like fighting enemies while in zero gravity. The game's story takes place on the Ishimura, a planet-cracking mining operation harvesting resources that loses communication. Soon, a team is set in to investigate, but like any good horror story, it isn't long until trouble reveals itself. In this case, a necromorph outbreak, essentially the zombies of this game, due to the discovery of the red marker. It's here we're introduced to Isaac Clarke, our silent protagonist that we'll grow to learn more about as the series progresses. He never talks and only grunts in combat, but surprisingly it isn't so odd that he doesn't speak. The few characters that do interact with Isaac talk enough without it feeling awkward that Isaac never responds. But where he lacks in communication, he makes up for it in his determination to find his girlfriend Nicole, a senior medical officer who works on the ship. While Dead Space did adapt Resident Evil 4's over-the-shoulder point of view like many games did at the time, the gameplay did more than simply having the player shoot the zombie in the head or shoot their limb to slow them down. The necromorphs in Dead Space were fast and challenging. There were a good variety to go up against, each different in their attack. Some could crawl up walls and ceilings, others were slow but tough. But the highlight and selling point of Dead Space was the ability to shoot off the limbs on necromorphs. This would not only slow them down, but could also change the way they go after Isaac, almost aggravating them to the point where their attacks were sometimes faster. Isaac has the ability to use stasis on them, which practically freezes them in place for a limited time, and this is extremely useful for large groups of necromorphs. There are even puzzle elements where the kinesis ability allows Isaac to move items out of the way or shoot them at enemies. Ultimately, it does blend Resident Evil's action with its puzzle-solving mechanics, but does this in its own way. Weapons are, of course, Isaac's number way of attacking. He can also swing and stomp on enemies, but it isn't really the way to go when attacking. But stomping feels so satisfying when necromorph limbs detach and roll away. Isaac starts out with the plasma cutter, basically the starter pistol most games give you, and it does its job pretty well. You can even beat the whole game with it, and there's a trophy or achievement that wants you to do so. Along the way, he'll be able to purchase and find other weapons. Discovering nodes can also help upgrade Isaac and the weapons to become stronger in combat, or these nodes can be used to unlock rooms full of special goods to collect and use, which, depending on the difficulty you chose, can either help or possibly harm you depending on how you use them. Weapons can also be changed from vertical or horizontal aiming, allowing for greater accuracy. While most games relied on various icons to display things like the player's health or ammo count, Dead Space has most of this information on Isaac himself, seamlessly weaving all of this naturally onto his suit and weapons. It does help to clean the screen of clutter and helps the player focus on the eerie atmosphere and isolated environments. Isaac will have to traverse the entire ship, completing minor and major quests to progress. Each area presents a new challenge, whether that would be new enemies introduced or challenges like being outside the Ishimura as your oxygen runs out. While the game is full of hues of brown, tannish colors with the grayish metals, like a lot of games at the time, the varied environments never make each area feel repetitive or dull. One of the great ways the game adds tension are the vents. Sometimes enemies will break through these to attack, and sometimes they just won't show up. And these appear all throughout the game, even on elevator ceilings. You will always be cautious of these because you just never know what will appear. Isaac and his small crew aren't the only people aboard the Ishimura. If he does run into any survivors, they are either long gone and have practically turned psychotic, creating some gory, unsettling in-game moments Isaac runs into from time to time, or they meet a grisly end. In Dead Space, you only have yourself to worry about. Even to this day, Dead Space still holds up extremely well. After playing the game multiple times and getting the platinum on the PlayStation 3, the atmosphere and the scare still get my blood pumping. The style and gameplay of Dead Space is hard to match with any other game out there, and plot elements introduced like the religion of Unitology and its followers, the cause of the Necromorphs, and the Marker will become a bigger force later on. Isaac may have survived the Ishimura, but his nightmare was just starting. Clearly, Dead Space became a smash hit, becoming way more than a simple Resident Evil clone cash grab. Its success allowed EA Redwood Shores to be renamed to Visceral Games, giving the studio its own identity. Dead Space 2 arrived in 2011, with its story picking up 3 years after the original. The events surrounding the Ishimura have been covered up, and Isaac's been imprisoned, used by EarthGov for the imprint of the marker design on his mind after exposure to it previously. Since the marker didn't have an effect in turning him into a necromorph, it's left him with dementia and violent hallucinations that get progressively worse. Dead Space 2 sees Isaac attacked from multiple forces: the Necromorphs, EarthGov, the Church of Unitology, and the demented hallucination of his deceased girlfriend Nicole. Somehow, it's a miracle Isaac survives it all. The game includes a number of improvements and expansions upon the original, but the biggest change is Isaac's new voice. Now he talks, and it never distracts from the silence he had in the original. I think if he didn't talk, it may have gotten old by that point. With it being a sequel, the story needs to bring in change and growth. Isaac talking was a needed step. Dead Space 2 would pick up a bit more on the action with some incredible cinematic set pieces, taking inspiration from Uncharted 2 Among Thieves. The game really balances these more dramatic moments with the eeriness and isolation experienced in the original. But this time, Isaac isn't necessarily alone. Technically, he'll be doing everything by himself, but now he's in contact with 2 fellow survivors who he meets at various points in the game. Ellie, who is someone Isaac grows fond of, and Strauss, someone who's like Isaac but is far worse. It's a big change because Isaac now has something worth fighting for. The game's environments also receive an overhaul. Since the game takes place on the Sprawl, a space station built on Saturn's moon Titan, there's more variety in what Isaac walks into. From the housing of civilians to a school and a mining site, there's so much Isaac can see. And there's a lot more variety in these areas than in the original game, with more color and detail present. Some of these areas have windows Isaac can shoot to suck out necromorphs into the deep, dark depths of space, but Isaac will also be sucked out and has to be quick to bring the windows shutter down or he'll die. It's such a cool new feature that forces players to think before shooting. There are many terrifying moments in Dead Space 2, but the top 2 are probably Nicole haunting Isaac and the infamous eye surgery scene. Of course, Nicole is a hallucination, but when you think about it, he also never really got proper closure over losing Nicole. She made her choice before the events of the original, and Isaac never truly got to say goodbye. So the memory of her is used against him by the marker, and there are some pretty dark, scary moments with Nicole. And the eye surgery scene practically speaks for itself. It can be pretty gory if done incorrectly. And if the game isn't enough of a struggle and you truly want a controller smashing, stressful, and anxiety inducing challenge, Hardcore mode is for you. It will make you want to rip your hair out. You only have 3 saves available for the entire game. That's 3 saves for 15 chapters. Use them all too early and you're screwed. Die and you respawn at your last save, and that could be so many chapters you have to redo. Make sure your skills are ready, use those saves wisely, and at least you're rewarded with a trophy or achievement on your effort. Outside of the single player story, there was a tacked on multiplayer mode. This was back at a time when having a single player story just wasn't enough for publishers. It was also during the time the success of Call of Duty was amassing thousands upon thousands online, and everyone wanted in. Even though these franchises were never the same as Call of Duty and should have never been compared to it, but sadly happened way too often. Was this mode fun? Sometimes. Needed? Not really. It was an objective-based competitive multiplayer mode where a team of Sprawl security officers were put up against a pack of Necromorph players who must stop the security officers from completing their objective. This mode was never popular enough for people to really talk about it, but it's still playable today as the making of this video. But where the multiplayer lacked, the DLC story for Dead Space 2 was more rewarding, especially if you played Dead Space Extraction, the Wii and PlayStation 3 on-rails prequel to the original Dead Space. Severed focuses on 2 survivors from Extraction many years later, and what's really interesting is how the actions of Isaac and in this DLC Gabe Weller affect one another's environments, sometimes undoing the actions of the other. How the DLC ends is so bittersweet, and I'm still desperate to know what happens next because it doesn't necessarily end on a cliffhanger, but there's also more we could know about the aftermath. Dead Space 2 would receive critical acclaim, with many calling it superior to the original Dead Space, likely in part due to its attempt at expanding to a wider audience. Plus, who can forget those "Your mom hates Dead Space 2" advertisements EA went all out on?
I think it'll make a person become insane.
This game is an atrocity.
Despite selling an impressive 2 million copies in its first week, and at around 4 million total, EA would be disappointed with its overall commercial performance, but this wouldn't stop EA from continuing the franchise. Isaac survived yet another nightmare, but it would take its toll, and his next adventure would bring him closer than ever to the origin of the marker and the Necromorph outbreaks. It also bring in issues behind the scenes, almost ending the series right then and there. When it comes to Dead Space 3, it's the one game in the trilogy most people are mixed on. Some love it, some hate it, others enjoyed it but thought it didn't live up to the first two. There's a lot that went wrong with Dead Space 3, and all of that leads to EA interfering with development. This, unfortunately, is nothing new. It's a publisher's job to make money, but greed can interfere with creativity, and that's just what happened here. Just like Resident Evil 6 and countless other games out there, once again, the Call of Duty effect crashed into Dead Space. Dead Space was no stranger to action sequences. Dead Space 2 had plenty of them, but 2013's Dead Space 3 leans even more into the action, the cinematic sequences, which can be pretty incredible and epic, and the gunplay, the first which would see firefights against humans. Action sequences aside, Dead Space 3 is a big departure from the previous 2 entries. The story feels heavier since Isaac is reunited with Ellie, now his ex, but their relationship is very complicated, and her group in search of answers to the origins of the Necromorphs and the Marker. We're also introduced to Carver, whose addition is a sloppy one. Dead Space 3 was always meant to be a co-op experience, but was to include Shadow Isaac rather than Carver, a new hallucination that signaled Isaac's mental state by that point. Despite EA forcing Visceral to drop the horror aspect of Shadow Isaac, I absolutely love being able to play the game with someone. However, Carver feels like an afterthought. His appearance in co-op makes sense, but when playing single player, Carver kind of floats in and out of cutscenes like he may have been there the whole time, but doesn't even aid Isaac whatsoever. Playing co-op does have its perks, like some exclusive co-op quests that only Isaac and Carver can do. Some even have Carver hallucinating while Isaac isn't, meaning each player sees something different. But what I really love is how Isaac interacts with Ellie's group. Survivors are rare in a Dead Space game, but these are characters I really ended up liking, despite most of them succumbing to their eventual demise. In comparison to the first 2 games, it's not just Isaac and whomever being placed in a situation they can't control and have to survive, but this time they more or less volunteer themselves into this situation and deal with the consequences of what comes with these answers. The game's environment is also dramatically different. The series' main staples are there like vents and puzzles, but now the game has a bit more open feel to it, especially in certain areas where Isaac can freely explore as much as he wants. There are also side quests introduced, which makes backtracking and exploring new areas as important as ever. However, it's the game's environment that truly stands out, with majority of the game taking place on a snowy, wintry planet. It's no longer linear corridors and ships or space stations, or I should say at least not too many of them. But I wish weather played a larger factor, but the change in scenery is greatly appreciated. Weapon parts can now be found and crafted together, creating original weapons that Isaac can use to his advantage. There are also scavenger bots that can be sent out to discover useful items. DLC weapons and outfits are once again available, but EA went a bit further than this: microtransactions. Players could use real-life money to purchase various resources like materials and scrap parts, things that could be found in the game. And microtransactions never make anything look good. Much like Dead Space 2 having a story DLC, Dead Space 3 would do the same thing, but instead of a side parallel story like Severed, which didn't require the main story, Awakened decides to pick up where Dead Space 3 left off. The most ridiculous decision that could have been made. What's even worse is that this DLC ends on a cliffhanger itself, one that we will probably never know what happens to unless EA ever decides to move forward with a fourth Dead Space. Not really the best to end things on. After the release of Dead Space 3, mixed reception came from both fans and critics. The shift to more action over horror turned off many, with a lot of people calling Dead Space 3 the worst in the trilogy. But it isn't a bad game, and I always look at the action as a sign of the greater emphasis on the game's heavier story. It's the third entry and the stakes are higher than ever before, and everything seemingly has to be bigger and better. I've enjoyed my multiple playthroughs of the game, but I do understand where the hate comes from. It took risks despite EA's forced changes, and expanded and introduced new mechanics that pushed the series forward. However, the game didn't sell well, selling fewer copies than EA planned for, and they were quick to kill off the Dead Space franchise. All that lore in the games, comics, movies, and books were basically wasted. After Dead Space 3, Visceral Games had 2 more games lined up, and neither were Dead Space. One would be Army of Two: The Devil's Cartel, and the second was Battlefield Hardline. The Devil's Cartel would be a flop for the franchise, ending it there and then, while Battlefield Hardline, a Battlefield spin-off, would receive mixed reviews and ultimately be the final game ever developed by Visceral Games. But before that would happen, Visceral was working on a Star Wars game codenamed Ragtag written by Amy Hennig. Unfortunately for Visceral, EA Games would close the studio on October 17, 2017. EA's greed would take up both the Dead Space franchise and the creative talent of Visceral. It's often been said that Visceral was closed because EA wanted to shift to the trend of multiplayer games, and Visceral's single-player games didn't fit their plan. There were plans for a Dead Space 4. Taking place sometime after Dead Space 3, humanity would be facing extinction by the Brethren Moons. Ellie Langford would have been a possible protagonist for the game, and would see her trying to survive on a day-to-day basis, scavenging supplies while fighting for her life against necromorph-infected ships. The player would have their own ship that likely acted as a hub to go back to. Rather than having linear levels, the fourth entry is planned to have a new non-linear style, similar to what was introduced in Dead Space 3. The story's plot would start to be uncovered as the player explored new areas, and the range of exploration would increase into new sectors of space. It's also likely the game would have included old and new types of necromorphs, like the ones planned to function in Zero-G. And Dead Space 4 would lead into a 5th game. Likely trying to cash in on the gap left by Dead Space, in 2020 a Dead Space successor, the Callisto Protocol, would be announced. Directed by Glenn Schofield, a co-creator of Dead Space, the game released in 2022 to mixed reviews. From personal experience, the Callisto Protocol has good intentions, but doesn't even come close to the heights of Dead Space. And the Callisto Protocol would have been a decent trip of Dead Space nostalgia if a Dead Space remake wasn't literally released a month later. Perhaps in response to the popularity of the Resident Evil remakes, EA resurrected Dead Space with a remake in 2023. While not truly necessary, I mean the original still holds up very well and a proper remaster would have sufficed, developers EA Motive looked to put so much care and effort into this game and they listened to fan feedback. What's nice about the remake is that it doesn't appear to be an exact one-to-one remake, but it also isn't a complete reimagining. There is the obvious graphical upgrade with even more detail for Isaac and the environment, but some missions have changed and there are new obstacles to overcome. This is great for Dead Space veterans like myself who have played the original, especially with the addition of an alternate ending, which is something new to look forward to. Perhaps the success of this remake will lead to a remake of Dead Space 2, or better yet, a return to the original series with a proper Dead Space 4. After all, we're still left on a cliffhanger with the fates of Isaac, Carver, Ellie, and Earth itself, and with this much lore to digest in the series, as fans, we deserve a proper continuation or conclusion. Dead Space is an incredible franchise. There is just so much lore to dive into, and even when the games did have more of an action feel, there was still enough tension and adrenaline of facing the unknown. Was it a series that was forced to grow too big? Most likely, and it also suffered from forced changes in the gaming landscape. It's almost humorous to see how EA wanted the game to become something it's not, and then a decade later we're returning back to the original form, let alone a single player game when EA was all in on multiplayer. But regardless of any pitfalls in the series, it's simply great to see this series returning, and I can only hope this is the start of something bigger. But let me know in the comments below, what were your favorite moments in the Dead Space trilogy? Will you be playing the Dead Space remake? Please be sure to like and subscribe for future content. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next video.